Hi, I'm Valerie Engelhart. In this video, I am going to be painting a hippo in the water based on a photo I took at the Woodland Park Zoo, and that's in Seattle. So I have my paper, which is like a Hanamulle rough press cotton paper, and I have it in a portrait orientation, even though the majority of my painting is going to be done in landscape. The reason I'm doing that is I am applying currently some quinacridone gold up in that upper right corner to act as sunlight cascading down. And because the water is going to be in the, landscape form, by keeping it in portrait and holding it vertical versus horizontal, I am letting that paint flow downwards. And this is to let gravity and water do a lot of the work for me to create this water scene. Right now I'm using Daniel Smith Undersea Green. And for the most part, I am applying the paint to dry paper. There are some spots where it touches the quinacridone gold and is merging with it, and that's great. It's giving me a loose atmospheric effect, so I'm completely fine with that. For being a watercolor artist, I don't paint a lot of water scenes. It's something that I would consider myself being a bit weak at, so I do want to work on that and improve and become more comfortable with it. I'm gonna add some Rockwell Canada Paliba Diamond Blue to add some blue into my water, and it's like one of my favorite colors. I have to use it. Now notice I'm not mixing the paint together. I'm not putting in my paint and then going in over and over trying to correct things. This is just a first colorful wash, and I want to keep things loose and playful, and I want the colors to be somewhat distinct but merge naturally. Now I'm going in with some Daniel Smith Jadeite or Iridescent, no, not Jadeite, Iridescent Topaz. It's a very light green that has a lot of shimmer to it, and I think it works really well with that undersea green, and I like having a little bit of shimmer on the water. I think it's pretty. So now I'm just splashing some water, lifting my board to get that water to flow downwards. And now I have my board in the position where I will paint the majority of this piece. I'm dropping in some purple now. I have my photo of the hippo that I took off to the side, and right now I'm just laying in some landmarks, some of the darkest darks. I have put my photo into a black and white mode so that I'm just focusing on values. And so I'm just looking at my photo and I'm concentrating on the shapes and where they are in relation to each other. And I'm using the purple because purple's pretty and it makes a good shadow. And I don't know, hippos, even though they're like a gray color, they look kind of purple. And I'm an artist, so I'm not gonna make it an organic looking purple. This is gonna be a purple hippo. And I want this color right now to diffuse and be blurry, because then I can adjust it later with some hard lines and more, I wouldn't say confident, because I'm pretty confident right now with my brush strokes, but to give it more form later, if I go in too dark right now, it's all just gonna bleed away, and I do want some of that quinacridone gold shining through. That way it looks like there's light shining off of this hippo that's coming out of the water. And the two purples I am using are both by Rockwell Canada. One is Alexandra Diamond Purple, that is the cooler purple, and the other one is Royal Purple, that is the warmer purple. Now because that hippo is coming out of the water, I am adding some purple into the water while it's still wet so that purple reflection mixes in. In my photo there's some shine on the water, so I am just introducing, my own clean water just to lift some of that paint and get a little bit of shine on the surface. Now it's no secret I love using texture techniques, and the cling film technique is one of my favorites. I am using it to create the ripples on the water, and as you can see I'm putting down my cling film and I'm pulling it to create these long horizontal marks. I didn't have it long enough to go the entire length of the paper. I just grabbed the 2 that I had, and I didn't want to go get more. I didn't want to be wasteful. And so see, it did create a divider line kind of in the middle, which is what I was trying to avoid, but it's okay. This is just a first wash. Everything we put on top later can remedy that. I can lift things by scrubbing. I can apply darker pigment. Basically, I've hit that point and I'm not worried. I know that I can keep going. But I love having those cling film marks because it lets me better visualize how the water is flowing. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but when I was doing my wash, I was using one of my size 3 mop brushes. And I did that because I wanted to have a lot of water. So right now I'm moving on to my size 8 round brush by Silver Black Velvet, and I'm applying pigment in between the lines of my cling film marks because as you see as I do that, the lighter marks pop out more and it makes it look, well, like whenever light is shimmering off the water, that kind of movement. And so I'll be doing that a lot throughout the piece, waiting for things to dry, seeing where I want things to be darker in the water, and doing pigment in between those white marks. Starting to define things on my hippo now, just finding like a nostril or where I want the face of the hippo to be separated from the background. Also refinding that area of the eye. Because I did this all without a sketch, I am reliant on the loose marks I placed in my first wash to act as landmarks for me to see about where I'm going to put something. Now, watercolor can be a little unforgiving in its transparency, so if I got something very wrong, it would be a little more difficult to fix. But for the most part, as long as you get things within the right area, you can make adjustments pretty easily by just adding either a hard line or a darker color somewhere else to reshape a piece. After all, part of what makes a great piece, I think, is the mix of hard and soft edges. If everything's too soft and blurry, I don't really know what to focus on, but I do get a bit bored if everything's a hard edge. So speaking of hard edges, that big block shape I just painted in, that is the back of the ear, and that is something I'm going to keep going back into over and over because I just never quite think it's dark enough. And so one thing I'd recommend doing is if you're at a part of a painting and like you know that it should be good, but you're just not sure about it, take a picture of it and look at the picture. I don't know what it is about it, but because it hasn't changed anything except taking the picture of it, but viewing a photo of a painting can better let you know if it's done. Because once I saw a photo of my artwork, I was like, oh yeah, that's totally a hippo, and that ear definitely looks correct. Whereas while I was painting it, I kept going, I don't know, is that dark enough? Is this right? Oh, so much second guessing. So that's one little tip. Painting in some wrinkles behind the ear now, because hippos are pretty hefty creatures. So right now I am measuring using my brush against my reference image off to the side, where to place that other ear, because where it looks like I've placed that fuzzy line to be my landmark, looks like it's at too extreme of an angle to be correct. So I was looking at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, that can't be right. I must have messed up. But I took my brush, and unfortunately I can't really show the trick right now because this is already recorded, but take your brush, take it to the image, and line up the points. So I had my brush at a diagonal to line the bottom of one ear to the bottom of the other ear. Then without moving my arm, keeping my brush at that same angle, I brought it over to the paper to make sure that angle was correct. And it was. And that just blew my mind because I was just so sure that I'd gotten it wrong. Right now, because there's a lot of texture on the hippo, I'm using some dry brushing to create that texture. And I'm actually gonna go in with a lot of texture tricks on this hippo to get the effect I want. But for right now, it's just some dry brushing. I'm adding a little bit of that undersea green just because I feel like I wanted to kind of marry that water with the hippo. And it was okay. I don't end up using it very much on the hippo itself. But that is one thing I tend to do, is if I've got a color in like the foreground or the background or some other element of the painting, I do try to bring it into my subject. And just darkening that area around the ear again. This was a bright summer day when I took this photo, so the lighting is very stark. There is a lot of contrast. I've grabbed my quinacridone gold to do some negative painting. So I'm painting some lines in a few areas around the hippo, and then I'm bleeding it away into that sunny background. This is a way of trapping the light and also giving shape to something without actually painting the thing. So for example, on that ear, there's hair on that ear, and so I painted some jagged lines to suggest little tufts of fur, and then softened it into the background to help that ear pop a little more from the background. And on areas such as that other eye, you do the line, but you do it just a little bit away from where you last painted. And that leaves like a little white gap or a very light colored gap. And now that has moved the edge of the hippo and makes it look like that part is really shining in light. So that trick is to capture the light. And this painting I have sped up to 150%. This is a much larger painting. I've got more going on, so it took me quite some time to do. Right, just painting in between some of those lines now, trying to use whatever color is local to whatever's on the water. So if an area has more blue, I'm going to use the blue in that little like oval type gap. If there's more green, I'll use green. If I'm getting close to where the hippo is going to be casting a reflection or a shadow, I'm going to use more of the purple. But I mean, obviously this was done wet into wet, so some of those areas are merged and mingled. And in that case, I can paint in a chunk of blue and drop in some green, or vice versa, since it is watercolor and you can still at this stage do wet into wet. Wet into wet can be done as long as you have a wet surface. But this part, painting in between those lines, it's meditative, it's fun. Like I have said earlier, painting water is one of my weaknesses, I would say. So I do hope to work on that more, or I plan to work on it more. Shouldn't hope, I'm the one in charge of my destiny. But I'm just trying to relax and go with the flow, not stress out about how it looks, just enjoy the process. And because the hippo is my focal point, all of the contrast and the most interesting, dynamic parts of the painting are going to happen near that hippo. And as we come down the paper, it's going to have less contrast, less saturation, just less visual interest. Doing a little more of that trapping the light trick behind the ear of the hippo. All right, going in dark again. I've let that layer dry, and I'm back at that ear like I told you I would be. Just adding in, this is Rockwell Canada Cosmic Sound. It's a really dark blue. And I am using that color on the deepest, darkest shadows. A little more dry brushing on the side of the hippopotamus. I'm starting to fear that I actually said rhino at one point, but definitely a hippo, though I do plan to do a rhino sometime in the future. I did try one before, but I wasn't very happy with it, so I pitched it. But you know, should probably revisit that. Right, at this point I want to lift some highlights, so I have picked out a synthetic, flat, with firmer bristles, but it's still soft, to scrub my paper and lift some of that paint out where I want to re-add a highlight without it being done with gouache. And so wet the brush, scrub, 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 dot it with the paper towel. Wet my brush, scrub, 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 dot it with the paper towel. Rinse and repeat. Though only do this after the area is dry. Now you can definitely lift an area that's wet, but to do this scrubbing back and forth, I really do recommend that the area be dry. And the reasoning for that is twofold. One, you are more likely to disturb the paint that is around the area you're scrubbing. And the other reason is, depending on how wet it is, whatever scrubbing you do, the paint will rush back in. And then not only will you lose that highlight you were trying to get, but it could actually be darker, because if you scrubbed too hard, the paper will be damaged, which, if you don't plan on painting over that again, no big deal. But if you still have wet paint that's going to seep into the area, that area is then going to be darker than it was before, more than likely. So you will have achieved the opposite effect. So let it dry. Let it dry, then scrub. All right, this is a technique I very rarely use, but the texture on the Hippo just called for it. So I have a cup of some dish soap. The brand, Dawn. I've got it in a glass cup. I'm using one of my kitchen spoons just to get some of those suds out. And as you can tell, I do not use this technique very much, so I'm a little rusty at it, I suppose. But I'm spreading those suds out, and I want those bubbles to be a little bit on the drier side, because if the bubbles are too wet and I add the pigment, more than likely it's going to bloom out further than I want the pigment to go. So that like blue that I'm dropping right now would end up in my background. And the reason I know that is because I have tried this technique a couple times before and had that exact thing happen. So I'm making sure to grab the bubbles at the top of the cup, because the cup is narrow, the wet bubbles are at the bottom, the drier ones are on the top, and watercolor is pale when it dries. So I'm going in with my darkest color, the Cosmic Sound Blue, and I'm dropping that in. And what that's going to do is, as the bubbles pop and dry, it's going to leave these really teeny tiny circles. And that just looks so perfect for a hippo. And by the time that this is done and dry, I am so pleased with how it ends up turning out. Like, it looks exactly the way I needed it to be. The downside with this is you can't dry this with a hair dryer. You have to be patient. So it's good to do this technique before you have to like go run an errand, or before you go to bed or go do lunch. Just, you're gonna need to give it some time. But it is so cool. It's so much fun. I highly recommend giving it a try. Now, I do have a lot of that texture going on the back of my hippo, and just to add some cohesion, I'm putting a little bit on the snout area. And for this, instead of that dark blue, I'm using both of the purples, the cooler and the warmer purple. All right, it has dried. Look at that beautiful texture going on. It is so cool. I am scraping out some of my crackle paste, because this is a painting where I do a lot of things where I have to just let it dry. So I spent a long time letting that bubble texture dry, and it looks fantastic, but I felt like I needed even more texture. And there was this big like patch of light on the back of this hippo. And so I was like, oh, texture and light, let's bring out some crackle paste. So I grabbed my golden crackle paste and a palette knife, and I'm spreading it on. I don't want the cracks to be super thick, because I do want the texture to have the same scale, that same sizing, because if the texture is too big, it's going to look too big for what the hippopotamus would have for texture. So I am spreading it a little thinner than I usually do, because I want these cracks to be finer. And then even more texture. I've got my toothbrush and I'm spattering some gouache on the hide, just to, like I said, give it even more texture, give it a little bit of sparkle, because in my reference photo, there are a lot of little dots of light. But I'm not about to go and paint in all of those individual dots. No. So toothbrush, splatter, we're good. Notice I just have some spare pieces of paper put down on my block. I'm doing that to protect the sky area, because I don't want that gouache going into my sky. So all I did was just use some scrap pieces of paper lying around, block it off, and then because that gouache is wet, anywhere where it got that I didn't want it to be, like on the back of the ear that's very dark or in the water, just get to it quickly before it dries. A little bit of water, pat it off with a towel. As long as you're gentle, it shouldn't disturb what's underneath. And then I'm grabbing the gouache and adding in some more highlights. These will not be as stark as the crackle paste. So I put the crackle paste where I wanted my brightest whites, which was that big sunny patch, and then everywhere else is going to have this gouache. And I'm also using it to bring the fur back into the ear that is the closest to us on this hippo. And with gouache, I wanted to stay fairly dry. That being said, because I don't want it like running, I want it to stay where I put it. So I'm using a synthetic brush because it holds a lot less water. And that way my application stays kind of thick and a little on the drier side. Obviously I need to add some water or the paint won't move at all, but it's not very wet and runny. It's pretty thick, almost a little thinner than toothpaste, I would say. Now I've gone back into some dark, thick paint, and I'm just adding another layer of darkness to those deep shadows. So like around the eye, and I'm also painting like around the ear again, and I'll be painting around the little furry bits on the ear just to have that white pop off from the rest of the hippo. Now I didn't show this being painted, but that eye had been bugging me, gave it a wash of the Polybia Diamond Blue, and suddenly fixed. So sometimes, if there's something you don't like, just try glazing another color over it, and it'll be just what you need. So right now I've got a close-up. I've decided I want to put bubbles in because bubbles are playful and fun and add more movement. So I've got some neat gouache with a synthetic brush, and I've painted just a few curved lines. And then I'm going in with my size 8 silver black velvet round because it does hold more water. And I am getting that gouache wet, letting it become kind of transparent over the water. That way it has form, but you can still see the water through it. And then as the sun's shining, it'd be bouncing off of those, well, it'd be creating that reflection, and that would create that kind of white outline. But I don't want it to be a circle. I want a couple spots that are easy to see, and then the rest of it fading away. So I practiced with that bubble, and I got nice and close to show you, and I'm just going to paint the rest of these zoomed out. And so one trick that I use to see if I want to do something without quote unquote ruining a painting is I'll hit a stage where I'm unsure and I'll take a picture of it, and I have an iPad with Procreate. And so what I'll do is I'll put that picture in the Procreate and I'll start adding in digitally what I think I want to do. So in this case, I pulled out some gouache brushes in Procreate and used the same techniques that I'm using in real life to paint those bubbles to see, would it work? Would it look good? And not only that, where do I want to put the bubbles? How many do I want to put? That way I could better plan my composition so that when I'm going into this part, I'm confident about how many and how large. And would it even look good? The answer was yes. Bubbles made it better. Honestly, if anything's getting too boring, add bubbles. They're fun. They're easy, they're a delight. And another thing that I do is if I'm unsure of something, or heck, even if I am sure, in a case like these bubbles, which I hadn't painted in a while, I'll grab a scrap piece of paper because I have plenty of those lying around, and I'll do a practice one really quickly just to make sure I've got the technique down so that if I do need to make a correction, I do it on my practice piece instead of trying to figure it out on the painting that I'm working so hard on. And the bubbles, because they are white gouache, it shows up much better on the parts that have a darker background versus as we get closer to the bottom, that area gets lighter, so it's a lot harder to see those bubbles. However, I do still want them there because, well, in nature, the bubbles are going to be going wherever they want, whether you can see them really well or not. And also, I'm going to be cropping this painting. That's another thing I like about being able to import things digitally and play around before I make drastic decisions in the real world. So as I'm doing this, I think it's good, but there's just something I don't like. And so one of the things I do in the program is I add like some long grasses, which were present at the zoo. I just wasn't sure if I wanted to add them or not. I added them digitally, it looked great. That meant, okay, that makes the composition stronger, let's add it. And as I looked at it, I went, well, I wonder if it'd look better if I cropped it. So I made a copy of my file, cropped it, and wouldn't you know, it looked better. So I made a note about how I cropped it in my program, and eventually, after this painting is completely dry, I get my mat and my rotary cutter and I lop 3 inches off the bottom. While we're doing this bubble right here that's right next to the hippo, can you see the texture on the crackle paste that I put on? It's not super in your face, a little subtle, but it's nice. I was very pleased with how it turned out. Like, there were so many times in this I was like, I wonder how this is gonna turn out, and then was just delighted. But see, I'm doing it on the hippo again, and some of that bubble goes off into the white background, and you aren't gonna see it. And that's fine, because you can see the part that is on the hippo. Now here's a funny thing I didn't consider when I did crop the painting. And I still have no regrets, because it did improve the composition, and I will forever go for the better composition versus trying to get into a competition. So I was painting this as a piece to enter into a watercolor show. And that's why I was using a photo that I had taken. I was making sure that I was following all the rules, but I forgot about the rule about the size. A lot of the shows I enter, the minimum is a 9-inch side, but in this particular one, it was 12 inches. 12 inches was the minimum shortest length that you could have on either side. So when I trimmed this bad boy down by 3 inches, I made the painting 19 by 11, thus disqualifying myself from entering it. And when I realized that, I was just like, no! Oh, how could I do that? I'm so dumb. But I still had a lot of fun painting it, so I wasn't like really mad, and I still had 2 good pieces to enter. It was just like that go figure moment. But still no regrets. Lopping that off, it was better for the composition. So I've got my undersea green. This is a Da Vinci size 3 quill brush. I chose that one because it holds a lot of water, and yet I still managed to get all of that water out before I'm even done with the stroke. So I do have to go in and tease that paint out a bit. I even try starting at the end of the blade instead of at the bottom of the paper and bringing it back that way. But I like starting from the bottom because of that, like, grass grows upwards, and that is a more natural movement for me. But I gotta do whatever I gotta do to get the painting I want. So just undersea green in different values, so how much pigment is on my brush. And I'm starting it at the very bottom because even though at this point I know I'm gonna chop off the bottom, I want the transition to be really natural with how I painted everything else. Now, while those grasses are wet, I am going in with juicy pigment so that we get some more variation. And the last thing I do, because I am just all about the texture in this piece, is while the grass is still wet, I am dropping in some granulation fluid. And that's going to encourage the paint to split a bit. And because the paint's already a little bit dry, I'm going to get some cauliflowers, and it is just beautiful. I really love all of the different beautiful texture effects you can get in watercolor. But anyway, here's that finished painting, nice and cropped. And if you liked this video, give me a thumbs up so I know to make more like it. And if you want to see more, subscribe, because I make videos every Monday and Thursday. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.